For years, Tim Ballard has been championed as a modern-day superhero.
The first time I saw one of the kids from the video, and it changed my life.
He was the face of Operation Underground Railroad, a movement that inspired hope around the world by rescuing children from human traffickers. However, Ballard's crusade to save innocent lives has always hidden a darker secret.
Oh, I think he's a pathological liar.
Beneath the accolades and the applause, a dark storm has been brewing.
I mean, I can't find a time that he's told the truth about anything.
Shocking allegations of sexual misconduct have surfaced, casting a shadow over his once unquestioned reputation. I am host Sarah James McLaughlin, and in this new season of The Opportunist, we explore the rise and the fall of Tim Ballard. Join us this October for Tim Ballard, Unmasking a Hero. Subscribe to a new season of The Opportunist now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Aellis.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, justice 60 years in the making, how 3 former victims put their abuser behind bars. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my plenteous co-host, Aellis.
Plenteous. Well, thank you. Does that mean a plenty? Because I am a depleted.
Whatever. You're plenteous. You're abundant.
I'm very
so
excited to be here with you guys tonight. I was telling Brett before we started recording. October, I love October as an adult. It's really fun. They're like pumpkin patches for kids. It's trick-or-treating. It's all this fun. But it might kill me, all the fun. We had 2 soccer championships tonight for my kids. Trunk or treats galore. Fall fests everywhere. There's so much fall joy. I need a little fall boring.
Well, by the time you're hearing this, you're ready for Christmas. So
I was going to say.
They're in the winter season. But it's okay. We're trying to get a little bit of a head, given Alice's impending break from the podcast.
Never break.
Could happen any day.
We could take a poll.
Are we taking a break? I'm looking forward to the break.
By the time you hear this, if there's not a baby out, then there's a real problem.
Yeah, that will be an issue.
We're coming in to get you.
Yeah. Probably a month and a half ago.
Month and a half ago. I might be back by now. Who knows? The world is my oyster
possible.
At this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still rooting for a Halloween baby, personally.
Well, okay, then I have to apologize. So there is a reason to the madness of today's case, because I hate these cases, but they need to be talked about. I hope we can cover this case and never have to do another case like this, because we've touched upon child exploitation cases before. We've talked to you guys about how, unfortunately, plentiful there are perpetrators out there. We've talked about the dangers of, social media. Even though this is now many months later, as we're recording, we're in the middle of the Delphi, Indiana double homicide trial, which obviously is a murder trial with victims who are young girls, Liberty German and Abby Williams. And I thought this was important to talk about because of the hope it can bring a lot of people. You heard from the teaser in this. This is justice 60 years in the making. And while this is a very sad story, it does have a bright light at the end. And I think all of us in true crime need to know, what types of crimes are out there. And so this is a tough one, especially if you have kids. But I think it's important to know.
Yeah, these kind of cases are not the ones we like to talk about. We often talk about when they're child victims, how difficult they are for us to do. But we really thought about this a lot, and people do need to know, not because we want to scare you, but because people need to know the kind of criminals that are out there, how their crimes can go undetected for a very long time. I mean, people would be surprised at how many upstanding members of the community who have no criminal record, who have no indication that they could do something like this at all, are predators who prey on children. And this was something we wanted to talk about, both because of that darkness, but also because of the light and because of how this case ended up. So this will not be an easy case to talk about. It's going to be a tough one, but we think it's an important one.
So there's going to be two parts of the story. The first one, we're just going to talk to you about the court case. It's not going to sound that exciting, but this is kind of like how you get Al Capone on tax charges. You know, there's predators out there, and thanks to our very stringent sentencing requirements for child pornography and child distribution, this is often the way to get a lot of child predators off the street. So we'll start with the court case, but what's really interesting is how we even ended up with getting this 80-year-old man behind bars. And this is one other thing we wanted to highlight about child exploitation cases. I know we've heard from people who've worked with, sex offenders, specifically child predators, and they have different thoughts on how long the criminal life is of these people. I will say this from prosecuting these cases pretty extensively as my time as a prosecutor. While we do see drop-offs in violent crimes by a certain age, this is something that's factored in during sentencing. We talk about this all the time. Even in court, the judge even takes it into account. Like, well, by the time he gets out, he's going to be 85. Like, probably not a trigger puller. That's something you hear in court. Child exploitation cases are a little bit different. We often see, especially if they're undetected, we can see these perpetrators continue to abuse well into ages you don't think it's possible. And this is an example of one of those, which is why I think these are so pernicious and so dangerous, because people who may look like a happy grandpa or happy grandma can still be a perpetrator. So let's dive into our story. In 2017, Robert Aellis found an email address associated with his older brother who he had fallen out of contact with, William. And we'll get into how he finds his brother on this website, but it's a sexually explicit website. And there are several photos of William that are available on this website. William is in his late 70s at this point. It's been decades since Robert has spoken to his brother, but Robert could not mistake who this person was. It was indeed his brother. And he had an interest in this because he knew of his brother's predatory tendencies towards young children, because Robert himself had been a victim of William decades earlier. So in an effort to catch William in his predatory behavior, Robert created a fake email address and sent an email to the newly discovered email address for William in November of 2017. He did this with hopes of catching his brother in a criminal act to finally find justice for all the past abuse he knew of. Because at this point, no law enforcement was looking into William, and Robert wanted to do something about it. Robert and William doesn't know he's talking to his brother. He thinks it is an email coming out of the blue expressing sexual interest, and the two start having very sexually explicit conversations. One in which William actually admits to sexually abusing a male infant in his family. And ultimately, William sends Robert several images of child pornography over the internet, as well as nude photos of himself.
Now, I'll say this, Robert, he's brave and courageous in doing this. I would not recommend doing something like this, because he really puts himself in a dangerous position in a couple ways. Number one, William is sending him images that are illegal. And you can imagine getting in a situation where you're trying to explain this to a prosecutor and saying, oh no, I was just trying to catch the bad guy. And the prosecutor saying, sure you were. Where are you going to sign on the guilty plea? Right? So I understand why he did what he did, but This was dangerous. And also, if his brother had found out who he was talking to, that could have turned into some physical danger as well, I can imagine. So Robert, he receives these and he does the right thing. He immediately turns and calls the FBI, and they interview him in February of 2018. Now, he tells them what he's doing and why he's doing it, and he gives them the login information to his fake email account so they can verify what has been sent to him and his story, so they know he's telling the truth. And this is a really great end for them, because one of the things that the FBI does and other organizations such as NCMEC, they have people on these sites trying to build up credibility with various predators so that they can catch them in the act, in something just like this. So at this point, FBI agents actually assume the online identity that he had created, and they start interacting now with William. And of course, they're making a copy of the email account. They're gathering all this information. They are subpoenaing various entities like Google. Google's able to confirm the subscriber name for the email address, that it was William Aellis. AT&T confirmed the subscriber of the IP address, which they were able to isolate, was William Aellis. And at this point, they've built a pretty good case on him. On August 4th, 2018, they execute a search warrant at his Boca Raton home. Several devices are seized, and after a review, they are determined to have child pornography on them. In an interview following the search, Aellis admitted to having sole access to the email address and confessed to viewing and downloading child pornography.
So I can't emphasize enough what Brett just said. This is kind of a 1 in a trillion case where catfishing in the reverse for justice works. Don't actually do this at home. When we tell you the full story of how Robert got to this point, you'll understand why the police believed him and why this was a very special circumstance. Because I think even Robert himself would tell you, I hope you never have to do this. I hope you never have to be the investigator to catch a child predator. This was his last resort, and we'll show you why in just a little bit. But what I hope you get from this story is be wary, report everything, be eyes and ears for your children and for your community. Now, this is a pretty straightforward case in the sense of child pornography. On April 10th, like within the week of the execution of the search warrant, April 10th, 2018, William is indicted on 2 counts. Count 1, distribution of child pornography. Count 2, possession of child pornography. This is pretty typical that we'll see. You're going to have the possession and the distribution. It's wonderful in the sense of being able to prosecute this federally. These are almost exchanged online. Online, you have your interstate commerce. You have the use of wires. That's how there's the federal hook. Whereas, as we know, actual child abuse cases, just like other violent crimes, are typically going to be state and local charges. So that's why you see so many long sentences and prosecutions by the feds of child pornography, when the reason they're going after the child pornography is it's the federal hook to be able to get the abuser off the streets. So here on June 15th, 2018, this is one of those fast cases, and a lot of child pornography cases go like this because it's so direct. You usually have the person confess. They've usually never been in trouble with the law before. You have their IP address. You have their phone number. Think about all the information you give Facebook or Instagram or TikTok when you sign up for an account. You give them a lot. It's kind of hard to weasel out of it and say, that wasn't me, especially if your face is in any of these pictures. So he's kind of caught, right? So he pleads guilty and he signs a plea agreement just a month later. And under that agreement, William would plead guilty to the first count, distribution, and the prosecutors would seek dismissal of the second count, which is possession. That's pretty typical as well. Because of the harsh sentencing guidelines, typically, it doesn't really matter how many counts are brought because they can look at how many images you have on your computer and how egregious the manner is in sentencing. Now, this charge carries a minimum 5-year sentence and a maximum 20-year sentence. But as we told you before, sentencing guidelines are calculated based on a number of things, including your criminal history. So if your criminal history is nil, nothing, it's going to be lower. You're probably not going to reach that 20-year sentence. And also, sentencing guidelines are, what is it? They're discretionary. The judge doesn't have to follow what it is. But this particular plea agreement, the prosecution agreed to recommend a 5-year sentence to the court. And what this means is the court is not bound by it. We do a legal briefs episode on plea agreements. There are binding plea agreements and non-binding ones. This is a non-binding one. 5 years you may think is pretty low. I think it sounds pretty low, but it's probably because he's 80 years old. There probably weren't that many images, and he pleads guilty within the month. So he's really not dragging this out. The prosecutors are going to recommend the minimum sentence. Now, when he shows up to court to do his sentencing in October of that year, it's held before Judge Robin Rosenberg. And like many sentencings, you have the opportunity for victim impact statements. We've covered victim impact statements in other cases before. You've seen them in the trials. This is one of the cases that I've seen victim impact statements really be able to change a judge's mind. So the judge has before them probably like, oh, this guy sent 3 pictures of himself, something like that, right? And they're thinking, okay, the prosecutors are recommending 5 years. But then you have 3 family members who take the stand. And this is not part of the child pornography case whatsoever. In fact, what they're going to say is completely outside the 4 corners of the indictment. But Robert, William, and Tom Aellis, these are his brother and his nephew and his cousin. They all get on the stand during the sentencing, and they themselves are older men as well. They're in their 60s and 70s. And they detail horrific sexual abuse at William's hands when they were children. So we're talking about abuse that took place half a century earlier. And they talk about the sexual abuse that was repeated over years by William. And the judge was so moved by these victim impact statements that she actually stepped off the bench for about 3 hours, which is a pretty long time, and takes this into account and comes back on the bench and declines to take the prosecutor's recommendation of 5 years and sentences him to what she can. Remember, there still are guidelines. And she sentences him to 8 years. This means that he is getting out February of next year.
Which, I don't know. These crimes, you always feel like, I'm glad the judge varied upward, but someone like this should never get out. And this goes to sentencing because, as Aellis said, you're sort of using this is the Al Capone method. And we see this sometimes. I think this is a good point to make sort of a minor, small p political point. There is a movement out there, and you need to be aware of it, of people who think that mere, quote unquote, mere possession of child pornography is over-prosecuted and over-punished. And you will occasionally see op-eds in various newspapers about this. And just remember, when these cases are prosecuted, almost always we are using something like possession of child pornography to punish someone who has done other things. And that is very much what is happening here. He is not being convicted of the abuse that other people have suffered. In fact, many of his crimes probably are beyond the statute of limitations. You could not prosecute them if you wanted to, but you're able to use the fact that he did those things in considering the overall sentence. And so ordinarily, maybe he wouldn't be looking at as much. The prosecution was willing for him to get the mandatory minimum. So the very minimum that he could get, they were willing to take that. And the judge said, no, you're going to get more time. I'm taking all of this into account. And that was the correct position. One other thing I'll say, because one of you is already typing the email, do not send me an email telling us we should call this child sexual abuse material. It is child pornography in the courts. I don't even like child sexual abuse material because sexual abuse in the images is not required. A photo that is surreptitiously taken of a child without their knowledge when they are nude is child pornography, and it should be punished as such. And as I said, there is this movement, and I'm not saying the people who use CSAM, which by the way is a mouthful as well, I'm not saying that those people are part of that, but I am very concerned about that. The same group of people who push for things like the decriminalization of possessing child pornography, using that to say, well, it's not sexual abuse. There's no sexual abuse here. That's not going on. That is something I'm concerned about, and I think it's something we all need to be watching for. So I will continue to call it child pornography because that's what it is, and I think that's an accurate statement, and I'm not really sure why people have a problem with it or why we went away from that in the first place, but in the courts, we still call it child pornography.
Yeah, the title of the criminal act is child pornography, just so you know. It's not us being like, oh, we insist on using this term. It is literally the legal term everywhere. I don't think there's some state who's adopted CSAM. The other thing about using child sexual abuse material is no one calls it that. They intentionally call it CSAM. And so in addition to inserting additional requirements, sexual abuse that's not required by the statute, you are also kind of minimizing it by calling it something like CSAM, where a lot of people don't actually know what CSAM stands for. So you're even erasing the additional requirement of sexual abuse that you're putting within it to basically make it like anything else. It's just another acronym. It's no big deal. It's a huge deal. Anytime you're doing this, the point is to sexualize children. And oftentimes it is without their knowledge because they do not know what is going on. It is usually from people that they trust. This is what's so pernicious. This case is a model of it. So many of these types of cases that we prosecute, almost all of them, in fact, is a close family member, is a close person, a coach, a teacher, a babysitter, a nanny, a mom, a dad, a grandfather, a grandmother, a brother, a sister. Wrap your head around that for a second. These are the people that these young children, sometimes under 1, sometimes 6, 7, 8, 13, 14. These are people that they look to for safety. That type of abuse is beyond even just physical. It is emotional, mental. I mean, it is utterly earth-shattering for these children, especially when these images live on for decades well into their adulthood.
So William will appeal this conviction in 2019. He will claim that the government breached its obligation in the plea agreement by offering evidence at the sentencing hearing, which would cause the sentencing court to impose a longer sentence. This is a real challenge. So if you enter into a plea agreement, for instance, and you agree, hey, we're going to recommend 12 months, and you go in and you say, well, Your Honor, I'm bound by the agreement to offer 12 months. But if it were up to me, he'd get life, right? If you say something like that, that's not really honoring the plea agreement, and you can have that sentence invalidated and sent back for resentencing. But in this case, the Court of Appeals did affirm the district court, and they gave several reasons why they did that. Number one, and this is true, there's no limitation placed on what information a district court may receive for sentencing purposes. It does not just have to be about the crime itself. It is about the entire person. It is about their entire history. It's about their background. It's about their other crimes. In fact, if you were charged with, say, 2 counts, and you go to trial and you're acquitted on one of the counts, the court can even take that into account. The court can say, okay, fine, the government didn't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, so you weren't convicted of it, but I find it's more likely than not you did commit the crime, so I'm going to consider that in the sentencing. You consider even that kind of stuff. And so they have this broad discretion, and the government did not advocate for anything beyond what they said they were going to advocate for. They recommended the 5-year sentence to the court, and it was up to the court to decide. And it certainly wasn't a problem that his victims were able to talk about this. And the plea agreement made it clear that he could get up to 20 years imprisonment. Frankly, I wish the judge had just given him 20 years, but it's a difficult situation. So this was something that was going to be considered. He should have known that. And it was not error by the district court to consider that. And it wasn't error by the government to facilitate the district court hearing this information. That's different than if they had then gotten up and said, you know what, we agreed to 5 and I guess we're bound to that, but man, I sure wish you could give him 8. They didn't do that, so they didn't violate their obligations.
And those are all very typical appeal arguments you'll see on sentencing, and they don't prevail because of the reasons that the appellate court said here. So William is currently serving out his sentence at FC Butner Low, which is a low security federal correctional institution in North Carolina. And the reason we're talking about this case is he is scheduled to be released in February of 2025, so in just a few months. Now, this story is devastating, but unfortunately, this is a pretty rote child predator case. They typically don't go to trial. They typically plead out. There's typically some search warrant. Someone's tipped off, right? Someone sees someone on a website. They tell the FBI or something. There's a search warrant. They seize their computers. They see all the child pornography on it. And there's a plea agreement. And you never hear about any of this because it doesn't go to trial. What's unique about this case is that this man's abuse of young children likely spanned more than half a century. And were it not for his victims fighting to stop him, he may never have met with justice. And with his release imminently impending, we wanted to share his story of how he was stopped despite law enforcement not acting on tips for more than 60 years. And again, this could be law enforcement not pursuing, but I want to tell you two really sad facts. Number one, it affects this case. Statute of limitations are a real thing. Statute of limitations have a role in our justice system, but unfortunately, many states have limits on when you can bring child abuse cases. And many of these victims don't really realize that there was abuse until after statute of limitations. And number two, there are way too many tips about child predators for law enforcement to investigate them all. I wish I could tell you that's not true, but having been on the investigative side, it is shocking. It is just shocking. You can't have enough resources because of the prolificness of the internet, because of the, I think, more and more stratified nature of our society, where we don't live in multi-generational communities anymore, where we have grandparents to be able to keep eyes on our kids, and lots of neighborhood children with lots of moms and dads' eyes on kids, making sure everyone's okay. We're just in a different society than we were previously. It has created many more pockets of opportunity for child predators to prey. And because of that, there just aren't enough investigators to go after all of the predators.
Guys, if you care about your kids' health, you want them to get the nutrition they need, and that's where Hiya vitamins come in. Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk growing kids should never eat. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, superpowered, chewable vitamin. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment our kids need with yummy taste they love. We're talking about vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. And I tell you what, kids love them. My kids love Hiya vitamins. They always are happy to take them. And in fact, they're usually asking us for more. You should check this out. And you can also check out the new Kids Probiotic and Nighttime Essentials. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your final order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/prosecute. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to HIYAHEALTH, hiyahealth.com/prosecute, and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Guys, it is the season of giving, and I know you're all out there stressing about gift shopping and thinking, what are you going to give your kids? And if you're like me, they're probably asking you for things that you know they'd love, but it gives you pause because you're concerned about them getting on the internet. You're concerned about them having phones, but you know that younger and younger kids are getting those devices. And that's why I want to tell you about Gab's holiday sale. Gab is the leader in safe phones and watches for kids, teens, and tweens. With no social media apps, no internet browser, and GPS tracking, Gab devices were built from the ground up specifically for kids and teens and are the way to keep your kids safely connected. And they have the tech kids want. There's the Gab Music app, which lets kids stream clean music. For older kids, there's the Gab Phone 4 Pro with hundreds of vetted third-party apps that can only be installed at parents' discretion. And kids get unlimited talk and text with Gab Messenger. But Gab Messenger also blocks high-risk messages and content with nudity from ever reaching your child's phones. Look, guys, my kids see me with phones all the time. My daughter, she wants a phone. She wants access to a phone. And that's why I'm glad Gab exists, because it's something that I can give to her. I can let her start to experience some of that freedom, some of that adulthood, but I know that she's protected. And I really think Gab is a must-have this year, and I can't recommend enough that you and your family give them a try, and do it now, because right now Gab is offering huge discounts on their phones and watches. The best part, there's no contract required. Just go to gab.com/prosecutors to get started. That's Gab, GABB.com/prosecutors. Gab.com/prosecutors. Terms and conditions apply. We're not trying to scare you with this episode, but we kind of are. But, we're not saying, you can never let your children out of your sight or anything along those lines. But it is important that people recognize just how widespread this stuff is and how widespread it has become because of the internet. And I think another thing, we're doing a better job of recognizing that a lot of these sexual abuse, sexual assault type cases, the statutes and limitations are just not long enough, because it often takes a long time for people to feel comfortable even making these kind of claims. We saw that a lot with sort of the Me Too movement and decades old allegations. I mean, think of like Bill Cosby, for instance, and how that was actually a problem, was the statute of limitations. We're doing better, but we're not there yet. And as we go through this, one thing you should think about wherever you live is advocating for changes to the law about statutes and limitations. As Aellis said, they're very important. They serve important roles. For all sorts of reasons, we have them. But for the most serious crimes, we often don't. Murder, for instance, famously has no statute of limitations for obvious reasons. These kind of crimes are right up there with murder in my mind. And even if you don't want to say they have no statute of limitations, they should have more than they have. And you're going to see that as we sort of walk through this. And we're talking about the crimes of William Aellis, crimes that go much further than distribution of child pornography, and crimes that are so heinous that they've earned him the moniker the monster in the closet. According to some of his close family members, and I just want to say, these are crimes for which he has never been charged and never will be charged because of the statute of limitations. But according to his close family members, and we're talking about his brother Robert, who we've already mentioned, his nephew Thomas, and his cousin Paul. I'm going to talk about all three of them, who were all three his victims and probably were not his only victims. He was a serial abuser. William's brother, nephew, cousin were all subject to his horrific abuse. Now, years later, they would embark on this decades-long journey to seek justice against William. And the information we're going to talk about comes through those victim impact statements we talked about, interviews, things that they were able to do to actually put William in prison. Now, these facts have not been challenged in court, so we can't say that everything has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt to be true. But I think given what we know about William, you can have a lot of faith in the story that we're going to tell you. And we want to highlight that his conviction is a testament to the bravery of these people and their efforts to get one child sex offender off the street and to bring justice to him for his many crimes. And that's one reason we wanted to share this case, because we do want to highlight that bravery that these men have shown.
And we had the opportunity, this is a very personal story. Obviously, we did not want to tell it without the blessing of the victims. And so these types of cases, because they've spoken in open court, they're not sealed, and they spoke to us. Specifically, we spoke with William's brother, Robert, who was kind of the spearhead of this whole fake email address that ultimately caught him. He gave his blessing for us to tell this story, but not because he wants his story told, but because he wants to encourage other victims who may be suffering decades later to say, I know it affects you, even half a century later, that there can be hope. And my story, hopefully, can be hope for you to continue to seek justice, if not for yourself, then for the other potential victims that you could be putting a stop to. And, one of the things when we spoke to Robert that was just devastating is the reason they gave William the name Monster in the Closet was that despite the fact that these three men had grown up, really become incredibly productive members of society, have beautiful families, got married, had children, On the outside, I don't think you could tell. I mean, it's incredible what they've done with their lives. But one thing that they realized is that they had to tell their loved ones about what happened, because this monster in the closet, this abuse they suffered 60 years ago, would pop up all the time, and it would take over, everything they were feeling, and they needed to process it and put that monster back in the closet. It wasn't something that left or became less painful after the years, but it was something that they carried with them day in and day out. And I think that's something that is very common throughout all types of sexual abuse cases, not just ones against children, but it is one of the most violative crimes against any person. A lot of our victims who we've spoken to have often said, I wish they just killed me, because then I wouldn't have to live with this. And that is one of the saddest things to hear from your victims, because you see what they mean when this monster comes out and overtakes their life. And oftentimes we see that utter depression that takes over, that they have to live with it day in and day out. So this story goes all the way back to 1957. Robert, who goes by Bob, is just 8 years old. He told me that he was a little bit of a surprise baby for his parents. They had 2 older sons who were, 12, 15 years his senior, and then he came along as a surprise. So he was only 8 when his older brother, 20-year-old William Aellis, got out of the Navy, and William came back to their family home in Brooklyn, New York. Now, Bob and William's father had recently died, so young Bob was so excited to have his older brother back at home, to have another male figure there. He loved his brother. He was like this adult figure. He no longer had his dad. And for the first few months, Bob said it was incredible. It was so great to have his brother home. But one night, William snuck into Bob's room where he was sleeping and began sexually abusing him, something that Bob said would continue for years to come. Now, Bob describes horrendous sexual acts, and being a young child, he didn't know exactly what to do or where to turn. We're not going to detail them here. I'm sure your mind can go to the darkest of places, but there are some things you cannot unsee or unhear, and I don't want to be the bringer of those types of things to your life. But just know that humans can be capable of some of the most depraved acts, and oftentimes they are against the vulnerable population. And what's more vulnerable than a young child who doesn't understand what's happening and doesn't know who to turn to, especially when the abuser is someone they're supposed to trust, almost like a father figure in this case. Now, Bob said he never explicitly told his mom, but that he, at least from his perspective, thought that his mom knew something was happening but did nothing about it. I want to emphasize this point. I haven't spoken to his mother, who has passed away, I believe. I can't speak for her, but this is something we see in child abuse cases. Kids often don't know how to verbalize what is happening. They don't know it should be verbalized, and they don't always know. But you'll often hear kids say, well, of course everyone around me knew. Whether that's true or not, it is the inability to communicate for a lot of these victims that they think people around them know. So whether they know or not, this is why we tell you what really happens in the real world, so that if you think something is off, you need to be the eyes and ears of the community and not assume someone else is going to be the reporter of these types of abuse. Because sometimes all it takes is an adult who sees something off and does something about it.
Yeah, and I would just say, if a child tells you something like this, you need to err on the side of they're telling the truth. I'm not saying that there haven't been cases where children have been wrong about these sort of things or manipulated into certain things. Famously, the satanic panic cases, the child daycare center cases are examples of that. And children can be manipulated and they can be confused. But your initial position should be, I'm going to believe this, I'm going to investigate this, I'm going to look into it. And I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, and it's very easy to sit here in judgment over those people, they don't want to believe this is true. They don't want to believe it for many different reasons. They don't want to believe this happened to their children. They don't want to believe their own family member did something like this. I mean, that is a crushing allegation to hear. So I can understand the willful disbelief that often happens. But so often you see this story repeated again and again and again. So as hard as it is, you need to take these allegations seriously if you hear them. Fast forward to 1966, Bob is now 17 years old. He opens up to a girlfriend about the abuse that he has suffered at the hands of his brother. She is the first outsider to know about the abuse. This was incredibly brave of him, particularly in 1966. I can imagine this not going well, but she listens to him. She helps him to see that this is wrong. It should not have happened to him, and it is not his fault. And she encourages him to go to the authorities. But once again, this is an incredibly difficult place for a 17-year-old to be in, and he's not ready to do that. And that's another reason, sort of the statute of limitations. You know, the clock is ticking on all this, right? But he's not ready to do that. He doesn't feel safe at home anymore. He has nowhere to turn, so he actually decides to join the Navy to get away from home and to get away from the abuse. It's 1969. He's 19 years old, and he's actually home from the Navy, and William makes a sexual advance at him. Now, Bob is an adult at this point, and he is physically larger than William. He grabs William by the collar, throws him against the wall, and says he will kill him if he ever touches him again. And finally, this puts an end to the abuse that William inflicted on Bob.
And let that sink in. That's more than a decade of abuse. And it's, again, at the hands of a brother who is almost like a father figure because of how much older he is. And Bob, unlike a lot of victims, actually does something about it because he can. He's physically larger. Oftentimes we'll see perpetrators lose interest in a child once they become of age. For whatever reason, they're harder to control. They talk to more people, whatever reason it is. But this is incredible that he's able to essentially use his physical force to threaten his brother and say, don't you ever touch me again. But the story doesn't end there, because up until this point, while the abuse has been horrific against Robert, he doesn't really know that this is affecting anyone else. But around this time, he finds out he's not alone. He finds out that William's also been abusing his nephew, Tom, who is 10 years his junior. So at the time that William stops abusing Robert at 19, he's still abusing another 9-year-old, their nephew, Tom, and also his cousin, Paul, who was younger. Now, Bob realized that William was going to continue this abuse if he didn't speak out, because all of a sudden he realizes this abuse is not limited to me. It wasn't something about me. A lot of victims blame themselves. Now, it's because I was in the next room, or I shouldn't have worn that bathing suit. It's all my fault. We see a lot of victim self-blame, but here he's realizing, oh my goodness, basically everyone who's around him who's vulnerable is going to be abused by him. So he musters up his just courage, and Bob approaches the NYPD and reports the abuse. However, because the abuse Bob reported was outside of the statute of limitations, the NYPD told him they couldn't do anything about it. Now, back then, this is the 1960s, the statute of limitations was as short as 1 year. I tried to find when it changed. Now it's something closer to 5 to 10 years, depending on the exact situation, once you reach the age of majority. But back then it was about a year. And look, law enforcement, if they can't prosecute something, they're not going to waste their resources on investigating a case, because it's not going to go anywhere. They probably said, well, is he still abusing you? No, I told him I'd kill him. Okay, well, what you're reporting happened 2 years ago. Even if we found that you're telling the truth and we have evidence to prosecute him, we can't, because literally the statute of limitations is a bar from being able to bring this case. So we're not going to expend our resources, especially in New York, if there's other child predators or there's murders or bank robberies. So it's not a surprise that because they can't bring a case, they're not going to investigate. But what a devastating thing to be told. I'm sure he didn't know what a statute of limitations was at 19. You know, like, what is that? It's a legislatively created rule. It doesn't exist absent a legislature saying this is when you have to bring a lawsuit. And we'll talk about Bob's work to change the legislation around the statute of limitations. This is really incredible. Like, while he's trying to stop his brother, you know, like 60 years later, he's also trying to change the legislation. And I'll tell you, even today's New York statute of limitations to file a child abuse claim is still 5 to 10 years longer than it was before. But let's say it happens when you're a child, you turn 18, this clock starts ticking, and you may have to bring that claim as early as when you turn 23, which I see a lot of you in the chat, especially those in healthcare who report people telling you about abuse that happened decades earlier. That's completely out of the statute of limitations.
So in the sentencing, we learned about some of this that was going on in the 70s and 80s, and we talked about William's nephew, Tom. And he was 22 years younger than Williams. And at the sentencing, he gave a graphic description of the abuse that he suffered at Williams' hands. When he was a small child in the 70s and 80s, he would have to go to Williams' mother's house after school while his parents worked. Williams' mother was Tom's grandmother. And look, this is a fact of life, right? I mean, a lot of people are having to work multiple jobs. Kids, they need somewhere to be when school lets out at 3 o'clock. And sometimes that can be the kind of thing that does open them to this kind of exposure. And it certainly happened to Tom. Tom was only 5 years old at the time, and William was grooming him. And it wasn't long before William began molesting and raping Tom on an almost daily basis. And he did this for years. And Tom's suffering didn't end there. He went on to allege that other neighborhood boys would beat him up constantly because they were also being molested by William. And Tom, he was the one they could take it out on. He was William's nephew. They couldn't do anything to William, but they could take it out on him, and he was the one paying the price. And William, this also is not that uncommon. Tom would go on to say that William would drive him out to New Jersey, where he was further abused by William's friends. It's often the case that people who are engaged in this kind of activity, they are not alone. They, especially now with the internet, there are circles, and we see this kind of thing happen, and it seemed like it happened to Tom, and his home life provided him no reprieve. He was already living in an abusive household. In fact, when Tom worked up the courage to tell his mother what was happening, her response was to beat him severely. And he would also claim that his grandmother was aware of the abuse, and rather than protecting Tom, she enabled William.
And again, this is the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You can imagine that if you hear something as horrific as this, that a parent may think that you're just telling really tall tales. And that is not okay to tell lies, little Tommy. And so we haven't talked to their parents or grandparents. We don't know what they thought, but we often see victims not believed. And remember what it takes to believe here. You have to believe that your own son and or your own nephew is doing one of the most monstrous acts ever. How could someone you're related to, who you trust, who you see at Christmas and Thanksgiving and on, all the weekends, could be a monster? Of course that's not true. Instead, 5-year-old Tommy is probably lying. So we better make sure he doesn't keep lying, because you know what happens to liars? They end up in jail. So I'm going to discipline you. You can easily see a situation like that. Now, in the early 1980s, after moving to Delaware, Bob is an adult now. He has, his own family, but he can't let this go. The NYPD couldn't do anything about it. So he actually, even though he's now in Delaware, his brother's not there, he goes to the Delaware State Police and tells them of William's crimes. But as you probably know, if you've been listening to our episodes, there's nothing Delaware can do about it because all of these actions happened in New York. Remember, states have jurisdiction over their own cases. So I can understand why someone would think, I just have to go to the police. Unfortunately, because of jurisdictions, that's not totally the case. Delaware can totally believe Bob, but they literally can't do anything about it. It's not their case. It's not their jurisdiction. And they're not the feds. So at this point, Bob reaches back out to New York 20 years after the first time he reaches out to NYPD. And again, because of the statute of limitations, they still say we still can't do anything about it. And we can't investigate this case. There's just nothing we can do about it. I'm very sorry for what happened to you, but there's nothing we can do. Around this time, his nephew, Tom, who's also an adult now, writes a letter to the FBI about William's abuse. So now he's going to the feds, but he never hears back from them. again, I can't tell you how many tips the FBI get, especially about like child predators. And if it's detailing abuse from like 20, 30 years ago, you can imagine like it's going to be outside the statute of limitations. What are we going to do? There's not much they can do. But undeterred, Bob and Tom decide to try and use law enforcement to seek justice repeatedly wherever they are. They're not successful. Again, I can't blame law enforcement too much because they're not bringing present day claims. So they don't know that William is currently abusing anyone. All they know is what happened decades ago. Statute of limitations, they can't do anything about it. So I don't think this is necessarily a failure to investigate by the law enforcement. It's that their hands were tied because of the laws that were written.
And this is one of those things that they're running into brick wall after brick wall. And I think at some point they started to feel like, are we ever going to get justice here? And years pass and nothing happens. And that brings us to 2017. And at this point, we're half a century after initially speaking up about this, suffering this abuse, reaching out to law enforcement and getting no progress. And Bob and Tom decide at this point, they're going to have to take matters into their own hands. As I said earlier, not necessarily something you should do, but you can't say that they jumped to this. They tried to pursue your sort of typical standard moves to take this person off the street. It is impossible to know how many people he victimized over this period of time. And in 2017, they are deciding we are going to do whatever we can to stop that, even if it means taking matters into their own hands. And at this point, they had lost contact with William. They didn't know where he was. They didn't know who he was. So they created a fake email address, which they used to go on various adult websites looking for William. They figure William's been abusing people for 50 years. There is no way he could resist the internet. There is no way he could resist using this new tool to continue his abuse. And wouldn't you know it, they were absolutely right. In 2017, so they've been trying this for a while. In 2017, they find him. They find him on Flickr through some sexually charged photos that featured William. At this point, they were able to find out that he lived in Boca Raton, Florida. And this is when Bob goes undercover. And using a false identity, he begins corresponding with William via email. At the same time, Tom Aellis is reaching out to Julie Rendelman, who is a former district attorney in New York, and sharing their story. And Julie asked the men to come see her in New York, which they did. And after speaking with them, she reached out to the Brooklyn DA to see, once again, is there anything that can be done? But the statute of limitations is fatal to these claims, and it had passed. But the men stay in touch with Julie as they continue this catfishing effort online to try and finally get some evidence they can use to bring William to justice.
I'll say Julie really is a hero in this case because we as prosecutors do get calls all the time from the public. In fact, we like trade off days where it's like our job to answer the public phone calls. And those are exhausting days because you'll literally get calls like, my cat's stuck on my roof. I'm like, what am I supposed to do about it? I'm a lawyer. But oftentimes you'll get these types of calls where you can even believe the person and their story is horrendous, but there's nothing you can do about it. And here you can see that happen to Julie. And she's like, what you're telling me seems horrendous. I mean, they literally drop everything and drive up to New York to talk to her. And she's like, this is all horrendous, but look, I can't do anything about it. But stay in contact with me because if you found him online and you have any evidence of him doing this within a statute of limitations, like I will jump on this. My hands are tied right now, though. I can't do anything about your past abuse cases. And so they do. These guys stay in touch with Julie and they continue their efforts online to get William to do something illegal, essentially. So Bob keeps corresponding with William, and William would send disturbing emails about things he was doing. He's bragging about basically his criminal conduct. You know, William says things like he's watching his neighbor's 4-year-old child and that he watches kids in the bathroom at Disneyland because he lives close to Disney World, because he lives close to Disney World. And Bob actually tells law enforcement about this. They're like, hey, he told me he watches kids in the bathroom. And so law enforcement actually reach out to Disney and get security footage. And while they see William there on the security footage, they don't have any incriminating evidence. So the law, like, police are trying to do things, but like they don't have anything other than these like words. And then the fact that he's at Disney could mean anything. Finally, William takes a misstep. And this is finally something that law enforcement can act on. William becomes comfortable enough with Bob's online alias that he sends sexually explicit images to Bob. Bob smartly doesn't open any of the images because guess what? When you open them, they're cached on your computer, and then all of a sudden, like, you are now in possession of child pornography. So if anyone sends you spam, don't open it. Just delete it. And he promptly forwards this email to Julie, the prosecutor in New York, who he'd been keeping in touch with. And when Julie gets these, she recognizes that this is likely child pornography, so she immediately contacts the FBI and sends those emails to FBI. So this is the right way of doing it, even though it's still a very risky path.
Let me just go ahead and say, for those of you out there wondering, this is not entrapment. It's almost never entrapment. Entrapment's like something you see on television. In real life, the only entrapment is if basically you have no proclivity to commit a crime and someone convinces you to commit a crime. William is way down that path. So you cannot be entrapped into doing something you would do anyway. So he's fine.
It would be like if I threatened you, like I have a blade on your daughter's neck, and if you don't send me a child explicit picture, I will cut her throat. Something, like, you see what I mean? Like, entrapment is used to scare people and it sounds sexy, but like, he was going to send these photos to people.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to prove entrapment. It's like an incredibly high bar. So it's not an issue here. So in 2018, an FBI agent in Florida reaches out to Bob, and Bob tells him everything about William's history of abuse and his own vigilante efforts online to catch William in the act. At this point, the FBI, as we said, takes control of the email account, and they begin working the case. And they are now the ones who are emailing with William. By April, the FBI is executing a search warrant on 80-year-old William's home. He is 80 at this point, and as Aellis said, he is still committing these crimes. And they're able to find the evidence they need to finally put him behind bars. Because of Robert, Tom, and Paul's efforts, they catch William distributing child pornography, and though the men may not have been able to be vindicated for their abuse, they were responsible for ensuring that William was finally held accountable in some regard. Guys, we want to talk about a podcast that we are so honored to have been a part of on multiple occasions, Silver Linings Handbook with Jason Blair. If you guys have listened to our episodes, we talk about so many things, and the thing about Jason is he is so good at interviewing. He is able to pull out thoughts and entire conversations that you didn't even know you had in you. And he does that not only when it comes to true crime and not only when it's with us, but with so many people from so many different walks of life. Areas of focus have included well-being, mental health, the law and criminal justice system, true crime, religion, society and culture, and people who are underrepresented in the mainstream media. And Jason is a former journalist who worked at the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and other newspapers, and you will see it. He is a journalist at heart, and he has never lost that urge to find interesting things and to find the truth. What we feel makes the podcast difference is that it is truly not scripted. I can promise you that, having appeared on his show multiple times. Basically, we never talk about the things we're going to talk about. It is not scripted at all. And he uses the same natural curiosity you would have sitting in the living room, and his focus is on making a difference.
It's so true. I really love this podcast because no matter if you've heard this person speak before, Jason somehow is able to put everyone at ease and share some of their deepest, most inner thoughts. And you walk away learning more, not only about the interviewee, about Jason, but about yourself and humanity. This podcast focuses on the big cases like the murder of Gabby Petito and the disappearance of Maura Murray and Brianna Maitland through interviews with their loved ones. But this year, Jason has also had a particular focus on Indigenous people, including the missing and murdered Indigenous women, violence against Natives, and difficulties on reservations, a topic that you know is near and dear to the prosecutor's heart. And we love that Jason has also put a particular focus on this vulnerable population. But Jason also looks at the bright side. In 2 upcoming episodes, Jason will take you to Alaska, where Indigenous communities have partnered with state and local officials to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis and to preserve Native culture and their way of life. There is so much to be gleaned from this incredible podcast. Listen, you will not regret it. To subscribe, just go wherever you listen to your podcast and subscribe today. Silver Linings Handbook.
It's the Christmas season, and for a gift that's always on time and lasts a lifetime, you can't do better than Masterclass. With Masterclass, your loved ones can learn from the best to become their best. Masterclass is the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best. That's why Wirecutter calls it an invaluable gift. Get unlimited learning. Learn from any Masterclass instructor anywhere on a smartphone, computer, smart TV, or even in audio mode. And look, guys, I know y'all are all into true crime. I'm into true crime. When I turned on Masterclass, the first place I went was FBI criminal profiler John Douglas. His whole series on how to think like an FBI profiler is amazing. It will grab you immediately. You will not be able to turn it off, and it will just be the first step in your Masterclass journey. There is no risk with Masterclass. Every new membership comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Give your loved ones a year of learning with Masterclass. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/prosecute for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/prosecute. masterclass.com/prosecute. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to us talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from the Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you could save money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average, and auto consumers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles in your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month saving of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
So one thing I know a lot of you may be thinking is, surely there's something out of the ordinary about William. Like, how can someone be an abuser starting from what we know of, age 22 all the way to 80? Something horrific must have happened to him. What abuse happened to him? And I asked that exact question to Bob. I was like, was there anything in your childhood? I mean, you were one of 3 boys. Your parents were together until your father passed away. You know, you seem to have a loving home. Do you have any idea like where this came from? Bob was like, that's the $1 million question. That's the one question none of us can answer. As far as we know, there is no other abuser in the family. He had a great childhood. He was, you know, smart and handsome, and in the military, everything was going for him. Why do monsters exist? And I think this is really important. Sometimes this just happens. We can't point to a reason. You can't put these people into a box. This is why I really dislike people's arguments about, you know, certain perpetrators like Scott Peterson, for example. Like, he looks too normal to do something so horrendous. No, monsters walk among us, and sometimes there may be no reason why they are monsters. And so Bob is sharing this story now in hopes that he can help other victims of sexual abuse, particularly older victims. His aim is to be a beacon of hope for the community and help others gain the courage to speak out and seek justice, no matter how long it takes. But hopefully you learn from him and don't wait so long that the statute of limitations passes and that your own abuse can't be vindicated. And it's really funny. 50% of the listeners on today's live have dropped off. I don't blame you. This is really hard. A lot of people will not listen to this whole episode, but I think it's important to do these episodes because so many of the other true crime stories we tell, there is this story underneath, and then it leads to like a horrendous murder or whatever, and then we focus on that. This is so prevalent in true crime. And by true crime, I mean truly, it is in your communities, no matter if it's a large city or a rural area, that we have to be eyes wide open, especially because of the internet. And there are so many ways to be blindsided that we don't want you to be blindsided by it. If you have children, if you know schools, if you yourself are online, this is something you should be aware of. And like we said, there are other things that can be done. Whatever state you live in, look at the statute of limitations to report child abuse. As we said, when Bob was trying to catch William online, he was also working to change the law in New York on the statute of limitations. It's a little bit longer than it was back in the 60s, but it's still not that long. And when we start really showing that these predators, should there be statute of limitations on them? I mean, there are arguments on both sides, but I think look at your own state's laws and think about, if that was you who fell outside the statute of limitations, how that would feel if your abuser never met justice. Because these people typically aren't also like robbing banks. This is their crime, typically, right? They are child abusers, and that's typically it. Think about what that may mean for your state. And there are things you can do about it. You can speak up for victims. You can try to change the law. Or you can just be the eyes and ears of your community and make sure that these predators aren't just walking around free to prey on children, or any vulnerable population. Doesn't have to just be children. You can make a difference, and sometimes it's just an extra set of eyes that does make a difference.
And while we're talking about heroes here, I think it's certainly the case that Bob and Tom and Paul are heroes, but just another example I want to give you of how people can come together to make a difference in this area of criminality is really disturbing. And the more you learn about it, the more disturbing it gets. The child pornography industry, it's not just one-off photographs or something like that. Oftentimes, these are entire series. So the three most popular series are the Amy series, the Vicky series, and the Andy series. If someone is arrested for child pornography, the chances that they will possess some of those images is incredibly high. Amy, who, that is not her name, but at some point about 15 years ago, she and a lawyer decided they were going to they get notified. If you have one of these series, the FBI notifies you every single time your photos are found. So every single time someone out there who is in possession of child pornography has your photos, you get a call about it. And you can imagine the effect that has on people. Well, Amy got together with a lawyer and said, you know what? I'm spending a whole lot of money on therapy. These people should pay for it. And so she began to seek restitution. In all of those cases, she would get notified by the FBI and she would immediately make a restitution request. And she would make a restitution request against these people, and she wouldn't just ask for a little bit of money. She would ask for all of her therapy costs, her lost wages, pain and suffering, and she got up to a number that was like $15 million or so. And she would seek this restitution, and it would be jointly and severally liable, which means every single person who was prosecuted, if they could convince the judge to enter this restitution order, is now on the hook for the full amount. And if eventually the full amount gets paid out, then, she can't seek that restitution anymore. In 2014, one of these cases went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Paroline. And I remember when this happened because the Supreme Court basically said, You can't do this under the statute. Justice Sotomayor and Chief Justice Roberts wrote a concurrence/dissent basically saying, hey, this would be the way to fix this. You could fix this. Congress could fix this. And and I was working in Congress at the time, and this was something that I was very passionate about, and Congress got really passionate about. And it was an example of reaching across the aisle. And so it ended up being a bipartisan bill with Senator Hatch, Senator Feinstein, Senator Grassley, and Senator Schumer, who came together and wrote this piece of legislation that was eventually called the Amy, Vicky, and Andy Child Pornography Victim Assistance Act of 2018. So 2014 is when the Supreme Court decision came down. Took them 4 years. They got it passed. President Trump signed it, and now it's law. And now these people who are victims of child pornography are able to seek, in a way that is perfectly legal and perfectly in keeping with Supreme Court precedent and everything else, this kind of restitution. And it's a huge advantage for them. And it's a huge way to fight back against their abusers. So I say all that just to say, don't feel like the law can't change, and don't feel like people aren't willing to fight to create new tools to help push back against this. It is a huge problem, and we have to take it seriously. And I think we do need more tools. One of the big things is the statute of limitations issue, and I hope it's something that states around the country will deal with, and I hope the federal government will deal with it as well, because frankly, 5 years isn't enough. That's not enough. You should not be on the hook that if you're abused, you have 5 years from when you turn 18. You got until you're 23, as if, when you're a 23-year-old, you would be able to process this in a way that would allow you to prosecute these kind of cases. Something happens to you when you're 5. So that is a big thing, and hopefully one day that'll change.
Yes, that's thankfully one hopeful thing that comes out of this. And some of you have been asking, oh, what is this case? Why can't I Google it? I don't think this story has been told anywhere, because it's on the public dockets. You can find this case, William Aellis, on the public dockets in Florida. So you can see, all the public filings and transcripts there. But this is not a famous case, because this is one of hundreds of thousands of cases just like it. That's the sad part. So we are only able to tell it because we were able to speak to family members who wanted us to tell the story. But I don't think this has been covered on anything, on YouTube, on podcasts. That's not the purpose. This is a stand-in for so many cases just like it, but you don't always hear all of the background of how justice is brought and all the abuse that may be underlying a count in an indictment that just says possession of child pornography. We're trying to pull back that curtain so you see what a lot of these cases actually look like and what those tools are being used to do. So again, none of the allegations we've talked about before 2017 have ever been proven. No charges can be brought on anything we've said. These are based on victim impact statements and interviews with the victims. So that's as much as we can. There's no cross-examination. But the reason we are telling it is because so often all the most gruesome details are not actually part of the indictment, because they are outside of our realm of prosecution. So this was very, very heavy. For those of you who've listened to it, thank you, because I do think it's an important topic. And if you are interested in true crime and how it really affects victims and how it really affects our criminal justice system, I think this is very, very important to understand, especially when people talk about it in a way that clearly shows an inability to grasp what we're trying to fight. And it is not a problem that's getting better. If anything, it's getting much, much worse because of the internet. With that, we should answer some questions, Brett.
Yeah, let's answer some questions. One question I'll answer right now, people ask how you can help. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, is probably the biggest sort of advocacy group for legislation and just actions that can help with children who are suffering from this. Support them, donate to them, consider donating to them. They're a great resource for this. So it can be hard to know, like, what can I do? That's one thing you can do. And the other thing you can do which is a small thing, and hopefully most of you are never in this position, but be someone that people can come to, that they know if something like this is happening to them, they can come to you and you'll believe them. Because there's so many kids out there who are suffering this, and they don't know where to turn to, and they don't know who to trust. Be the person they can trust. Because there are more, this has been a very dark episode, and we've talked a lot about sort of all the monsters amongst us. There are still more good people out there, way more. And we can do a lot to help in our communities. So we should do that. Okay, with that, let's absolutely answer some questions.
We got to do some questions.
That one was dark, and I'm glad we did it, but I'm looking forward to getting back to good old-fashioned murder.
I was going to say, this is way darker than murder for me.
Okay, this is from G. Smith. I listened to the Michael Peterson episodes. What do you guys really think happened, if you had to guess? You guys joke about the owl theory, but is that your actual belief?
I'm not joking. We've always said
I'm
not a true believer. It's the presence of evidence, which is owl feathers. But anyways, what do I think really happened? That's a good question. What do you think happened?
I think she fell down the stairs, actually. I mean,
I think she had too much to drink.
I think the owl theory is really interesting. As I've said, I still believe that the owl theory has more evidence in support of it than any other theory. I think that's 100% true. But I really kind of feel like she just fell down the stairs, and that's the simple answer, and that nobody wants to hear that, right? Like a lot of the, it's kind of funny because in some ways I almost want to revisit that case because so much of the expert testimony has now been discredited, right? Like, can you trust Henry Lee anymore for anything? Now, I'll say this about Henry Lee, and we've talked about expertise before. The things that Henry Lee says in that case make sense to me. And we talk about how do you decide whether or not to believe an expert? We got two experts saying the opposite thing. What do? You use your own common sense, you use your own experience. It makes sense to me that if, for instance, someone is being beaten with an object and there's blood everywhere and the object's going up and the object's going down, there should be some cast off. You should see that. That makes 100%. I don't think you need to be, a doctor of physics or forensics to know that that's true. So that's the kind of forensic evidence that I find pretty powerful, but the rest of Dr. Henry Lee, who knows? So, yeah, I mean, I will say this. We have another question, which I'll just go ahead. Let's see. Where is it? I'm going to ask this question because this rolls right into it. Okay. This is from Danny. Of the major crimes you've researched for the show, who would you be most surprised about to find out was actually innocent? And I'm going to add on Peterson on this as well. Scott Peterson, Casey Anthony, or Adnan Syed. So the first thing I want to say about that is the one that I feel the least sure about what happened is Michael Peterson. Michael Peterson is a case that I don't know exactly what happened. I have loads of reasonable doubt. I could not convict. That is, to me, the reasonable doubt case where you see the evidence, you see the arguments for murder. How you could convict him, I don't know. I still don't know how you could convict him. He may have done it. Maybe he beat her to death. Maybe that's what happened. But that's the one that has the most reasonable doubt for me. As far as of those crimes, who would I be most surprised to find out was actually innocent? Most surprised? I'm going to do least surprised because Scott Peterson and Adnan Syed are absolutely guilty. They are absolutely guilty. And I don't care what anybody ever says about that.
You mean Casey Anthony and Adnan? You said Scott.
No, Scott Peterson.
Oh, Scott.
Absolutely guilty.
I was thinking Michael. I'm sorry. I was thinking Michael.
Scott Peterson.
Sorry. Scott.
Scott Peterson and Adnan Syed are absolutely guilty. Okay? They're guilty. And the people who don't think they're guilty, that's fine. Free country. You can believe what you want to believe. You're wrong. They are guilty. So I guess I'd be most surprised if they turn out to be innocent, since they are clearly guilty. The thing about Casey Anthony, the only thing I'll say about Casey Anthony, I think Casey Anthony's guilty. I would have voted to convict Casey Anthony. Casey Anthony, there's just enough about that case that you could convince me that she was really just so terribly neglectful and just didn't really care about her daughter that much, that her daughter did accidentally drown because she was so negligent. And then rather than, I don't know, call the ambulance, she just put her in a trash bag like she was trash and threw her in the forest, because that's kind of the awful, horrible person she is, right? Like I could almost be convinced of that. I don't see any evidence of that. Now, the evidence I see is that she did it on purpose, but, you know, I could be convinced of Casey Anthony based on the evidence we have. Now, you know, once again, if a videotape comes out of Scott Peterson, you know, I don't know, in another country when Lacey died, I guess I would have to consider that. But it would take something like that for me to believe it.
I'd agree with you there. Casey Anthony, because she lies so much, and a lot of people in her life lie, and she seemed like not a very attentive mother. I could totally see it not being like willful intent, but all the cover up obviously was horrendous. So I just don't know what to believe with Casey, because it's impossible to know anything, because I don't think she knows anymore because of how much she lies.
Okay, one last question. This is the most important question of the night.
Oh.
This is from Cecilia. Cecilia wants to know, is it a grilled cheese or a cheese toasty?
Oh, who says cheese toasty?
This sounds like a regional thing.
I've never heard cheese toasty. I must start using that.
I've heard cheese toasty, but I'm not sure where it comes from.
Is it an American term? Because I love it.
Yeah. I think it's like it feels like a Boston thing, right? Cheese
I've
toasty.
never heard cheese toasty, but I'm about to adopt it. So I've always said grilled cheese, which is, by the way, like one of the most delicious. I don't know how long it is because it's like childhood lore, but there was a period of my life from like age 5 to 7 where all I ate were grilled cheese sandwiches. So I was told. And I also remember it.
It appears in Britain they call them cheese toasties. So maybe that's where it comes from.
It sounds great. I just think it sounds amazing. I love it.
Justine wants to know, with or without tomato soup? I love
as an adult, definitely
soup.
with tomato soup. I just ate so many grilled cheese sandwiches as a kid. Like that's all I ate. But today, like as an adult, yeah, tomato soup.
Just American cheese, or did you go like fancy cheese?
American. It was like the kind that you take off the clear wrapper.
Exactly.
Like nothing special. Unlike white bread, no nutritional value. Lard on the outside, you get it nice and crispy on both sides. There's nothing nutritional about it. That kind of grilled cheese.
These days, you go to a restaurant and they're offering you like $35 grilled cheeses.
Okay, I will say though, I'm not opposed to the $35 grilled cheeses except for the price. But, New Haven has lots of unsavory parts, but it has great food. Pizza we've talked about. Did you also know that like there are incredible grilled cheese food truck carts? And there was this one, I can't remember, it was like a little hobbit house. Like you had to walk down the stairs. It was like an 1800s house, and all they served were super fancy grilled cheeses. And it was like a couple blocks from my house. And on cold winter nights, I would literally just trudge over by myself in pajamas and order very fancy like Gouda grilled cheese sandwiches. Delectable. Again, now as an adult. As a kid, I just wanted the Wonder Bread, lard, fried, clear cheese packaging.
See, I still prefer that. I would rather have that.
I will not turn that down. But I'm saying when you have like a really good, like substantive, they're all great. You can't go wrong.
Yeah. Okay.
Man, now you're making me really want to go make a grilled cheese sandwich.
I know, that's what I was just thinking. Unfortunately, we don't have, all we have is like fancy bread. We don't have any.
I know.
I make
sourdough bread, which is like good, but it's a little too dense for like a good grilled cheese. Man, maybe we should have a grilled cheese making party. I'm excited. White bread. What
you want?
Fluffy.
The best grilled cheese sandwich has no nutritional value. You're absolutely right. It's white bread
has no nutritional
with American cheese and butter.
Yes.
That's what you want.
Yes.
That's what you want. That's what make you happy. Okay. Well,
thank you for that question.
I enjoyed the questions much better.
It brought me so much joy to talk about grilled cheese sandwiches.
Yeah. See, we need more of those. So just you keep sending us those. We got tons of questions, but a lot of them are really deep and like thoughtful. And it's like, when we finish, I can barely even think anymore, much less answer these really deep
quick,
and thoughtful
though,
questions.
2 things. Back to food real quick. The 2 best food items I've ever had at someone's wedding was a mashed potato bar. Amazing. Like that should just be a thing. I didn't even know you could do that. Like literally just mashed potatoes and then like all the fixins. But like it's a wedding, so it's like 30 different types of fixins, bacon and chives and sour cream and cheddar, etc. And a grilled cheese and tomato, different types of soup bar. That was also awesome. Like little dippers that you could do as well. And they grilled it for you, so you could make your grilled cheese with whatever you wanted in it. I just wanted regular cheese. But those two things, if you're trying to woo me or get me into like a white unmarked van, just tell me you have a grilled cheese dipper soup bar or a mashed potato bar, and I will willingly walk into that kidnap van.
See, when we got married, you weren't part of the picture yet, but we just got Saw's Barbecue to cater. I don't know if you've ever been to Saw's. And we didn't have a cake. We had banana pudding. And it was so popular, we didn't actually get any of the banana pudding. By the time we got there, like all the banana pudding was gone. It was like, man, people love that banana pudding. That's pretty good. But yeah, so. But I'm with you on the mashed potato bar. Always one of my favorites. Love that.
Maybe we should just have like next birthday party. We're going to have a mashed potato bar, man.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Brett.
Okay. So thank you guys once again for the questions and for joining us tonight. No, this was a tough conversation, but as I said, I think it's an important one. And don't get mad at me if you want to call it CSAM. We're all on the same page. We're all fighting the same fight. I just have strong feelings about it. But if you have thoughts, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, add prosecutorspod for all your social media. One thing I will say, I don't think the chances of this are great, but I'm going to say it anyways. If you are someone who was victimized by William, he will be out of prison here in a few months. And maybe the statute of limitations has not run on your case. So would certainly be something worth maybe putting a phone call into the FBI and saying, hey, you have this case out of Florida. I have some information. If you'd rather talk to us, that's fine. We say that all the time. I know it's a difficult thing, but just know that if you were victimized by him, he has been brought to justice, at least somewhat. And there are people out there who are willing to fight for you. You're not alone anymore. You might have thought you were alone all these years, but you're not anymore. And, who knows, maybe we could keep him in prison where he belongs. Thank you to all our patrons. If you want to see these episodes early and ad-free, join us. We have a lot of fun, usually, maybe not so much tonight, but usually. And you get to see our smiling faces. And isn't that what it's all about? By the time you're hearing this, we're close to Christmas. So Merry Christmas to all of you. I hope you guys are having a great holiday season. We will probably, maybe, depending on what happens with Aellis here in the next few days, have one more episode, sort of a retrospective of the year. Talk about our favorite cases, and then we will be done for the year. You will have an episode on Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, but they will be bloopers. And then we'll be back with you in 2025. We have such sights to show you. You're going to love it. It's going to be a great year. I can tell you. It's going to be epic. So don't leave us. Okay, Aellis, before we sign off for tonight, do you have anything else you want to add?
Thank you guys for sitting through this episode. This is more like a PSA than entertainment. I know that, but thank you for sticking with us.
All right, guys, we will be back next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Aellis.
And we are the Prosecutors. Yeah, you guys better enjoy this because,
we're not
we're
going
gonna have any
what I was
lives for like 2 months.
I don't think people noticed last time because we recorded ahead of time, and it's not like we did lives all the time. We did the Murdoch cases live, but that was like a special thing. But this time, you guys are actually gonna feel the effects. Sorry.
Yeah. It'll probably just be me, hanging out.
It's gonna be so fun. People only want to see you. Just wear your top hat and read the dictionary. People will love it.
Yeah, it was
one
my
of
fault.
us.
I blame myself. I'm trying to fill time,
The
okay?
one who was not here was me.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Don't worry, guys. I'm not gonna be gone for long. I can't help it. I can't help myself. I miss you guys. I'm hooked on y'all.
Did you know you can watch all your favorite crime shows for free on Pluto TV?
Totally free?
Totally free. They've got CSI New York, NCIS, Criminal Minds, Blue Bloods, Tracker, FBI, SWAT, all for free.
There's something suspicious going on here.
Nothing suspicious, just hundreds of free crime shows. On Pluto TV, crime never pays, and neither do I.
Pluto TV.
Stream now, pay never.